As we were talking, it made me think of a quote that I really enjoy from Winston Churchill during World War II. He said, "This is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but perhaps it is the end of the beginning." And so that really leans in for me into where we are in our conversation. So over the past several episodes, we've covered quite a bit of ground, starting with definitions, talking about what it is autonomy means and what does that journey potentially look like. We've then covered leadership in terms of how this changes the expectations of leaders going forward. What does that leader need to do? How do they need to show up? We continue that conversation looking at culture in terms of how do you transition your organization from where it is today to one that can leverage autonomy effectively. And then we got into some of the foundational elements around data and how important that is, but not data purely from a quality perspective or, garbage in, garbage out, but really looking at a much more nuanced, wider lens on data. And then the last episode is really talking about governance. How do you take that leadership, that data ownership, that culture change, and create the context within which your organization can thrive? But throughout this conversation, we've sort of taken a bit for granted that autonomy is valuable, that it's something you should pursue. So let's step back. Let's peel that onion a bit and really have a conversation about why autonomy is a valuable pursuit for an organization. Where and how do you derive that value from autonomy? I'm Derek Aranda, and this is Supply ChAInge. Here, we go beyond AI hype to examine how to stand up intelligent supply chains in complex organizations. If you want a clear-eyed view of how to do this in the real world, this show is for you. As we go through this conversation about value, it's going to be important for us to move the conversation beyond cost. Cost is absolutely important, but in many ways, it's a limited lens through which to think about the value that you will derive from autonomy, or that you could derive from autonomy, and by extension, what you could derive from AI, from cognition, from analytics, from automation, and that full spectrum pyramid that we talked about that is the digital journey. To help illustrate this, I'm going to channel my inner Donald Rumsfeld. I remember he used to talk about there are three things, right? The things we know. That's where oftentimes I think cost sits, right? We know what we're spending on inventory. We know what we're spending on that transportation lane. We know the cost of that disruption from the supplier. So those are things we know. And then he talked about there are the known unknowns. The things we know are going to happen, but we might not know when, we might not know where, we might not know how impactful, right? So this is where things like weather. There's going to be a hurricane that hits the US this year. I don't know where, I don't know when, I don't know how strong that hurricane is going to be. Geopolitics is another great example of a known unknown. There will be a geopolitical disruption somewhere in the world. I don't know when, don't know where, don't know how impactful. And then we have our unknown unknowns, right? The things, those black swan events, the things that we cannot predict or that are such low probability events that they might not be worth thinking about or even trying to solve for, right? You look at the COVID-19 disruption that we faced 5 years ago. That falls closer to the land of the unknown unknowns, right? Even though we could have likely predicted that there would have been another pandemic, that horizon of possibilities is so vast that it's difficult for us to try to capture or think about it. So let's think about those three lenses: the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. As we think about where value sits in this conversation for autonomy, there are a couple of different buckets that we can start tying into that, right? As I touched on a bit earlier, cost sits a bit into that known bucket, the things we know that we can tackle. And then when you get into the known unknowns, that requires a very different type of organization. It's not about capturing data. It's not about reporting data or analyzing data. That then now becomes a function of decision-making, decision quality, decision speed. It becomes a function of integration across your supply chain ecosystem. And then when you get into the unknown unknowns, the value bucket shifts towards resilience, optionality. And so if you're just thinking about cost and optimizing what you have now, what you know, you're not wrong, but you're limited. And it's very important that as you think about valuing the investment that you want to make in AI, in automation, in cognition, in autonomy, you widen that aperture to look across all those buckets of value. So let's peel back those three buckets a bit further. When we think about cost and we think about investing in digital tools, oftentimes the metric we use is ROI, return on investment. And that numerator is oftentimes simply a change in cost profile, right? The cost of operating that activity tomorrow minus the cost we spend today divided by how much it costs me to build that capability, your investment. Pursuing that cost optimization, that efficiency improvement is absolutely critical. And that is a necessary part of supply chain activities to drive continuous improvement so that we can serve our customers better, improve our margins, and drive value for our organizations as well. So certainly this is not a criticism or a devaluing the importance of pursuing cost optimization. This is where you can bring in tools to reduce your inventory positions and reduce the cost of inventory. This is where you can bring in tools to be able to work more effectively with your transportation carriers, either by reducing the cost of loads or improving the service level that you're getting from your carriers. This is where you can reduce your maintenance spend because you're predictively improving your pump maintenance cadence. Absolutely important. The caution I put into this lens and why I say it's not enough is because oftentimes what I see is that when we run our pilots, when we run our initial rollouts of tools, we get locked into needing to see that cost result in the short term. And that's where the danger lies when you have a limited lens on just this one value bucket. Here's the reality. When you're implementing a new system, I always imagine that it's a bit of if you're going from one cost level to a lower cost level, it's not linear from cost today to cost tomorrow. There's a bit of a hump that you have to go over. And this is where the cost of implementing the new system, you might have a period of time where you're running both systems in parallel. This is the cost of training your people to move to adopt the new system and new processes. This is about perhaps bringing in a consultant or an implementer to work through this. So there's a cost sort of bump that you have to go through in order to get to that next lower cost position. And because of this, there's an urgency to be able to deliver return on that investment, because this is showing up in your P&L. This might be showing up in your balance sheet. This is showing up in your quarterly conversations that you're having in the C-suite. So there's this short-term pressure to say, well, now where are those savings that this business case was predicated upon? So you end up in conversations with limited set of incentives to try to drive that cost down quickly, and you might sub-optimize choices. Because again, you're not looking at the broader set of opportunities that this new tool, this new system, these new processes might afford you going forward if all you're trying to do is drive cost out. And in many ways, the very easiest option that a lot of organizations fall back on is, well, because now I have this new system, I can remove people. So that becomes a very big driver as well. Now I implemented the system, so surely I don't need the 5 people that I have. I only need 2, maybe 3. So reduce those other people. So it becomes very myopic in many ways that you start thinking about, well, now how do I take more cost out to justify that tool that we just implemented? That cost efficiency mindset, again, is not wrong. It's just not enough, because it limits the scope of opportunity that you end up pursuing. So now let's move from the known into the known unknowns and broaden that aperture that we talked about a bit further. What I find helpful in this conversation is to move away from a P&L mindset. That is that cost today, that margin today mindset, to one of a balance sheet where autonomy, AI, digital is really an investment, not an expense, not a cost, where autonomy is an asset. And as an asset, the benefit accrues over time. And it's important for us to broaden that horizon space, because as we go through this journey to autonomy, it's going to be messy. It's going to be muddy. There are going to be false starts. So if your time frame is narrow and you need that return now, you will miss out on the opportunity that that asset affords you with a longer time horizon. As we talked about those known unknowns, this is where that wider horizon becomes increasingly critical. And this is where we talk about two very important things. One is decision quality, and the second is decision velocity. So in that example of a hurricane is going to hit the US, I just don't know when, where, or how impactful. What then are the decisions that you need to think through and make as you prepare for that known eventuality? What are the quality of decisions around what inventory do I need to hold? Where do I hold that inventory? Historically, where are hurricanes likely to have hit? Who are the types of customers that will be impacted? What are the types of products, suppliers, carriers, and the list goes on and on and on. There are lots of decisions you're going to have to make in order to prepare for that known eventuality. The quality of our choices in all those spaces today is oftentimes difficult because that's a lot of information, a lot of dependencies, a lot of variables for us to try to manage with the people that we have. That is where the power of progressing up that pyramid to autonomy becomes a very powerful enabler for us to widen the surface area of decisions that we can make. Not only make, but make more effectively. So we can move into a space where it's not just preparing for a hurricane. It's preparing for a hurricane where, when, how much, what customers, what suppliers, better trade-offs, more consistent trade-offs as we're pursuing that decision space. The second one is around decision velocity. So now we have the hurricane. We see it being tracked in the Gulf. As that information is coming in, how quickly is that information being ingested into those choices that we made, the decisions that we made in preparation for the hurricane? How's that information now about the hurricane as it's tracking through the Gulf? How is that being ingested into our systems? How quickly is that now moving through our reactive decision-making processes as we adjust and adapt to the reality that we're now seeing? So yes, we had to plan for that hurricane maybe hitting Houston and Miami, but now we know it's coming up the Gulf. Guess what? It's probably going to go to New Orleans. So now how do I adjust what inventory positions I might have had? How quickly can I make those adjustments? What adjustments do I now need to make? Because there's different suppliers, different customers, different markets, different capacities for me to be able to respond to that potential hurricane now coming into New Orleans. Today, that is oftentimes a very slow, very muddy, very convoluted process for us to try to respond quickly as this information is coming in. Never mind the amount of information that we can process as this hurricane is approaching the coast. As you move up that pyramid towards autonomy, that decision velocity can accelerate tremendously. And it now compounds with that improved decision quality that you still have. So now you're making better decisions faster. So your ability to respond, your service levels, your ability to reduce the cost of responding to this event, your ability to work with your suppliers and your customers to prepare for this event, it can be exponentially greater. And this is true whether it's a hurricane or it is just your day-to-day activities. There are any number of signals that we need to process on an ongoing basis that had we known sooner, had we responded to sooner, we might have made better, more effective choices. So as you're thinking about investing in autonomy, again, the cost impact today, absolutely, thank and bank. But you also need to think about how do you value your decision quality, your decision velocity. That capability that you now have to respond to and anticipate, probably even more importantly than respond, anticipate events that today you just don't know. The unknowns, the known unknown. And as you continue moving on that spectrum now into the unknown unknowns, that cost optimized position, that decision quality, that decision velocity now allows you to position yourself for optionality, for resilience. Now for the things that you can't even anticipate that might be coming down the pike, because you now have the foundation to be able to consider a much wider range of possibilities. On that bell curve, you're now moving further and further to the edges of possibilities that you can, in fact, anticipate and respond to meaningfully. With that increased capability, the range of opportunities that you can explore expands. The number of SKUs that you can manage, the number of customers, the number of suppliers, the range of paths that you can act on grows. You can now deepen and enrich the integration that you have both internally within your organization, how you're engaging with sales, how you're engaging with finance, with customer operations, with sales support, with other parts of your organization, as well as how do you interact and integrate with your external partners, your customers, your suppliers. The amount of information that you can now bring in, the amount of data that you can now process expands. And it's there that you can now start seeing relationships, dependencies, variables that you might not have ever actually recognized. You can now not only see, but you can act upon. That becomes the nirvana that we talk about as you move up that pyramid of autonomy. The surface area that you can operate on expands enormously. And importantly, the number of shocks, the range of shocks that you can now deal with also grows. This is not to say that if another COVID hits and you have autonomy, you're unimpacted. Absolutely not. But your ability to respond, your response ability to these shocks improves tremendously. That is the third big bucket. And in many ways, that's the bucket that is the hardest to value. Because yes, you're dealing with lower probability events, but they also can be enormously impactful events. And if nothing else, this past decade has given us a rich vein of those high impact, low probability events that we can actually look back at and see this is a tremendous amount of value. If we're able to move up that pyramid of autonomy, positions us to deal with much more effectively. I published a piece on LinkedIn that talks to this exact issue. With the Iran conflict underway as we record this episode, one of the unforeseen secondary and maybe even tertiary effects of that conflict is with the oil and gas production shut in the Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz closed, locking in tankers and that product in that region, there's been a surge of demand coming to the U.S. And so we now have a significant number of oil tankers, LNG tankers, now wanting to get from the Gulf Coast of the U.S. to Asia. The most efficient way to do that is through the Panama Canal. One thing I didn't actually realize is that going through the Panama Canal, you can pay to fast track your cargo through. As these tankers now want to move through the canal, that had started backing up traffic. So imagine it went from a day or two to 4 or 5 days delay for cargoes to move through the Panama Canal. These LNG tankers, these oil tankers, because they're such high value products, they're able to pay to fast track. So they move to the front of the line. But now that just pushes the lower value commodities further and further back. So those are your grains. Those are some of your consumer goods. So secondary effect there is that grain, that fertilizer, that agricultural product that you might be waiting for in Colombia or in Brazil or in Argentina is pushed back. It's delayed. If you're a purchaser of those goods, did you anticipate that? I'm sure you saw the potential impact on your fuel prices. You might have even seen the impact on your fertilizer costs because of sulfur and urea coming out of the Gulf. But did you see that having a knock-on impact on the lead time for your materials because of the Panama Canal? It's being able to look at that much wider surface area of impacts. Perhaps you didn't anticipate it, but then how quickly did you see that reflected in your lead times? How quickly does that now propagate into your planning, into your inventory levels? How quickly does that shift? Maybe I need to get more of my product from North America or from other parts of South America, or maybe even from Africa or Europe, and that way avoid having to go through the Panama Canal. So how quickly does that information now propagate through your system in a way that you're able to react much more effectively? So far, I spent a fair bit of time talking what maybe the avoidance or negative side of the ledger. How do I take cost out? How do I avoid the negative impacts of an adverse event on my operations? But there's as much value that sits on the opportunity side of the ledger. As and when you move up that pyramid towards autonomy, that cost optimization and efficiency, the knowns that we talked about, your decision quality, your decision velocity improves as the surface area of optionality and resilience that you can embed in your operations increases. That also opens up a tremendous amount of opportunities that you can now go after. There are customers that you can now win, markets that you can now enter, products that you can now grow into because your cost position is optimal. Because you can respond to market signals much more effectively. Because now you can create options that your customers didn't have, might not even known that they could have. That's another fourth bucket that is important for you to think about when you look at valuing that pursuit of autonomy. This is why when I began, as important as cost is, it's too limited. The challenge for leaders as you think about your strategic approach to this opportunity that autonomy presents is to widen that aperture. It is to broaden the range of value buckets that you consider as you think about that return on investment. That return is not just about cost. It's about decision quality. It's about decision velocity. It's about optionality. It's about resilience. It's about thinking about how do you value all those buckets. And I think as we get into other elements of this conversation, particularly around governance, that's going to be an important element for you to think about how you create the frameworks and the decision processes where all these buckets are surfaced. When that business case is presented, are you challenging them of, well, what else besides cost? How does this help me make decisions better or faster? How does this help me respond to an adverse event or shock? Challenge the organization to make sure they're thinking about this complete range of value opportunities. Widen the reward system to go beyond cost and short-term optimization to that longer horizon thinking. As leaders, you're going to have to reorient how you measure and reward success. What do people get credit for? Who gets credit? This takes us back to that North Star conversation that we had on the leadership conversation. Is this a replacement mindset? Is this an opportunity mindset? That replacement mindset puts us very heavily on just cost. The opportunity mindset allows us to explore the full spectrum. Cost plus, plus, plus. Are you creating the governance structures? Are you driving that cultural change and transformation in a way that allows you to capture those buckets beyond cost? As we've been on this conversation, as I've looked across the landscape, it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the organizations that will separate themselves from the rest of the pack, the organizations that will capture the maximum value from this journey to autonomy, will be the ones that go beyond cost, that shift from just a replacement mindset to an opportunity mindset. Over the next several episodes, we're going to deep dive and explore how organizations are embedding AI into their businesses. We now have a number of lenses that we can use to think about the successes, the failures, the challenges that they're facing on their journey. We've talked about defining, well, what is that goal that we're working towards strategically? How do we think about that culture and transformational journey that we take the organization on? We've talked about data and all of its structures, the governance that needs to be put in place in order to maximize the value. And we've talked about how do you broaden your thinking around value from just cost to one that really looks at bringing in decision quality, optionality, resilience, and opens up the space for opportunities that the organization may never have realized that it could capture before. Those are important lenses for us to look through as we explore how organizations are bringing AI to life. I'm excited to go on that journey with you. Thanks for listening to Supply ChAInge. If today's conversation sparked questions, and it should, that's the point. Supply chain is complex, and these questions don't resolve in a single conversation. Share this podcast with someone who's navigating these decisions, and join us for the next episode as we continue exploring what it really takes to make AI work.